These worms are literally eating their way out of this plastic bag. But not only can they eat it, it's actually good for the planet. So if they can biodegrade plastic, could they be the answer to our planet's massive plastic problem?
Biology has found a way to some extent to deal with this.
Because the latest science on this is mind-blowing. Not only might we make plastic biodegradable, we might even one day be eating vanilla ice cream from recycled plastic and E. coli.
Yes, I mean, it's chemically identical.
Yeah, so we'll get back to that in a minute. Let's start with the worms. These little creatures are waxworms. Dr. Federica Bertocchini is a molecular biologist, and she first witnessed this phenomenon when she chucked a bunch of waxworms in a plastic bag as a hobby side project, because, well, who doesn't?
I bumped into the waxworm accidentally because at that time I was a beekeeper, because they live in the beehives. They are considered plagues by beekeepers. So I started cleaning my beehive, putting the worms in a plastic bag, and within a short time I realized they were producing holes.
The plastic started to degrade almost as soon as it touched the worms' mouths.
So we thought, okay, maybe something coming out of the mouth. So we start collecting this liquid coming out, called it saliva, but it's the liquid coming out of the mouth. So in this saliva, we found 2 enzymes that can reproduce the effect of the saliva, meaning oxidizing polyethylene. And it takes a few hours at room temperature in a watery solution.
And the amazing thing is that the worms can even digest the plastic, breaking it down into something useful for the worm.
The worm itself, when it eats the plastic and starts breaking it down, its guts react almost as if it was eating normal food. So that means that there's something happening with the physiology of the animal that extracts something out of this plastic biodegradation, and it just continues as if it were a normal diet.
That's Dr. Chris Lemoyne, who, inspired by Federica's findings, also began looking into these worms.
We found that the plastic allowed them to still retain all their fat and presumably continue with their life cycle.
Basically, these worms are fattening themselves up by whatever means necessary before they turn into moths, by which point they don't eat again, only reproduce.
I always call them bags of gonads that can fly, because that's all they do.
So there's a race underway to figure out just how this mechanism works.
That's the $1,000,000 or $1 trillion question, because once we figure that out, that's $1 trillion worth of plastic we can degrade.
Because as cool as the waxworms are, this is really about the specific combination of bacteria and enzymes that can break down plastic, something that's exceptionally rare in nature. So why is it so rare? Why is plastic so hard to break down? Well, in nature, most things decompose because bacteria breaks down the chemical bonds that hold a substance together. These enzymes and bacteria have evolved over millennia to break down whatever it finds in front of it. Then plastic comes along.
Here's a scene that has long since ceased causing any surprise. Dishes that bounce when they drop to the floor.
Nowadays, it gets a bad rep, but it's a total game changer for humanity. But nature's never experienced it before. Plastics are made up of long chains of polymers with very strong bonds, and one of the keys to breaking these bonds is through oxidation. That's what the worms appear to be doing with their saliva, introducing oxygen molecules to the plastic.
And this is something that's achieved in the environment through light, for example, high temperature. And this is the bottleneck. It takes a while because the environment has its own timing. So the worms, what they do is just introduce molecule of oxygen. So in a few hours instead of months or years or whatever. So this is it's a way to overcome the bottleneck of this reaction.
So what's next? Unleash the worms? No, that would be a terrible idea. Remember this?
They are considered plagues by beekeepers.
But even sticking just to plastic, the process is still way too slow to realistically solve our plastic crisis anytime soon. So stand down, waxworm armada. The real stars of this though are the enzymes. If the researchers can identify them and scale them up, there's a chance that in the future this could be one of the solutions.
It will take a lot of cash.
But now scientists are looking for similar enzymes in all sorts of other places.
Superworms too. So anything that has a worm in it, it seems to be prone to eat plastic.
In fact, over 30,000 enzymes have been identified capable of digesting 10 different types of plastics. One bacteria found in cow stomachs can be used to digest polyester. But the one that's getting everyone really excited is a bacteria called Ideonella sakaiensis, and especially its enzyme, petase.
Plastics waste in general, but more specifically PT, has infiltrated our environment. And Biology has found a way to some extent to deal with this over time. There was a discovery outside of Japan where they had found that microbes began to colonize on parts of a water bottle. Cells were actually living and maybe even surviving off the carbon within that plastic. We can take this enzyme out of the cell and we can begin to engineer that enzyme even further to be able to have better activity directly on plastic waste.
PET plastic that would take centuries to break down in nature, PETs can break down in a matter of days. But it doesn't solve our plastic problem. Not yet, anyway. To have any real impact at scale, we need to turbocharge how quickly it works. And that's exactly what Hal's team has done. And they named this really fast version of PETs, fast PETs. They did this using AI, essentially by using a vast database of all known enzymes in the natural world and then running simulations about which combinations and mutations would speed up the process, kind of like a form of computerized accelerated evolution.
Machine learning approach really it's rapid evolution to some extent on there, but at the same time, it's guided by observation. We saw that this enzyme was not very stable overall, and used a machine learning type of approach to figure out which point mutations would make this enzyme more stable, and found a couple of mutations that really both increased the stability significantly, but then also gave rise to a significant increase in the activity of this enzyme on plastic.
This cutting-edge technology opens up a whole new frontier of scientific possibility, and the team aren't done yet.
Thinking about trying to clean up plastic that's actually in the environment. Those applications don't have the benefit of being able to control the temperature and pH very well. So having an enzyme that ultimately is flexible enough to work in a variety of different conditions is extremely valuable.
Once PET plastic is broken down into its component parts, terephthalic acid and ethylene glycol, it can then be recycled into new plastic. But it doesn't necessarily have to be plastic. In theory, it could be used to make something better. Like this. Well, sort of. Because a team of scientists in Edinburgh have found a way to turn plastic into vanillin. That's the central ingredient in vanilla. And they did it using E. coli. Sounds delicious.
For me, and for anyone who's thinking about a nice vanilla ice cream, what are we not understanding about that?
We get asked this question a lot. Yes, I mean, it's chemically identical.
Okay, forgive me if the next part ruins vanilla for you.
So vanillin is a compound that's derived from oil that we pump out of the ground. It's the same feedstock that we use to make petrol that we use in our cars. So we, in essence, took one of those enzymes that had been reported to do the initial depolymerization, and then took the mixture of terephthalic acid and ethylene glycol that you get from that, and simply just fed it to our E. coli. But the way that I think about it is, yes, this compound's coming from plastic waste, and yes, it's coming from a bacteria, but I think we as a society are okay with eating food that has oil in it, the vanillin derived from oil. So why wouldn't we be okay with having a bacterium produce that for us?
Now, these guys aren't really trying to sell you vanilla ice cream. They're more interested in upcycling recycled plastic.
There's recycling plastics into more plastics, and then there's upcycling plastics into other compounds. The issues at the moment currently with that approach is that when you subsequently recycle plastic into other plastics, the value of that plastic and the quality of that plastic actually diminishes. So you enter into this downcycling approach that does solve the problem in the short term, but it ultimately generates the same waste. What we think is quite interesting about upcycling plastic is you re-enter that carbon back into the chemicals economy as something that's higher value. Vanillin is not the only product that we can make from PET plastic. The molecules that you get when you depolymerize PET are actually intermediates en route to a huge number of industrial products that we rely on nowadays. One of the most interesting ones that we're focusing on right now is pharmaceutical intermediates. You can take PET plastic waste and turn it into pharmaceutical compounds. So taking something that's actually damaging the environment and turn it into a source of human medicine. So medication, other flavoring compounds, materials for your clothing, cosmetics. It's quite staggering. I think this is only really the beginning of what could be possible in the area of plastics upcycling. I think that very much is the case.
So worms themselves aren't going to eat all our troubles away, but the science going on around this is genuinely exciting, and it's all thanks to nature for providing the inspiration.
People used to think I was mad. Some still do. The problem with renewable energy is that if we can't store it, on the days when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, we won't be able to use it. I'm just a quiet man in the background coming up with ideas. I don't have any qualifications or anything. I've actually never passed an exam. So I'm completely self-taught and yeah. I really started looking at things in the 1960s, when probably I was about 12 years old. I looked at the world and I realised it wasn't sustainable for using fossil fuels. I did look at lots of alternatives, but I'd always had the idea of using liquid air as energy. It's an energy carrier really, it's not an energy source. It's like batteries store energy, you can store it in various other means. And I chose liquid nitrogen because not many people were working on that. The liquid nitrogen engine works on the same principle as a steam engine. You boil the liquid nitrogen, same as you boil water into steam. That creates a pressure which acts on the piston or the turbine, and that creates your mechanical energy. The problem with liquid air has always been that it creates a very high pressure, and when you expand it from the high pressure, that creates cooling. That makes the gas shrink, and that makes it very inefficient. My invention overcomes that. This is a representation of the Diamond engine. You can see we've got the heat exchange fluid on top of the piston. As the piston approaches the top, it goes over the top and then draws some fluid in, and then we add in the liquid nitrogen. I'm just using air here, just to show how it works. By adding a heat exchange fluid on top of the piston and the gas and liquid nitrogen injected into the fluid, and it maintains the temperature as it's expanded. It is a very simple solution and it does seem obvious once you've seen it, but it's like most inventions, is having that sort of light bulb moment. The lawnmower engine was okay, but I needed something a bit more impressive to publicise that liquid nitrogen could power a car. So I modified a car engine and ran it up and down the street. It was 50 years in the making to actually finally get behind the wheel of a car powered by liquid nitrogen. You know it's going to work, but you need to actually do it to prove it. I have had it doing over 30 miles an hour. We're not all driving around in liquid nitrogen cars at the moment because liquid nitrogen is a low energy density fuel, so it will never perform like a petrol car. Well, obviously my neighbours have seen me riding up and down in this car. Most of them are just very interested. Some probably thought I was a madman, but now you have an invention that's only a small part of it. You need to then bring it to the wider world, show them that it works, and then find practical use for it. So we're using liquid nitrogen to store energy. On the days when we have surplus energy, we use that to compress the air and liquefy it. And then when we need the energy, we expand the liquefied air to drive a turbine and produce power. The advantages over using batteries are that it doesn't use any scarce materials and it doesn't wear out. Batteries may only last 10 to 20 years. This system will keep going for at least 50 years. Batteries are about 90% efficient. Liquid air can actually approach that if you use waste heat and waste cold from other industrial processes. Well, particularly with global warming, as temperatures rise, there's a much bigger need for refrigeration. More and more food will be wasted unless we can find a clean and efficient way of preserving it. We're using the Dearman engine on a truck refrigeration system. The engine itself powers the control systems, and the evaporation of the liquid nitrogen, which produces the cold, is used to refrigerate the truck. The Dearman engine replaces the diesel engine, which are very polluting at the moment. This has the potential to help reduce pollution in a really sustainable way. It is a big deal, yeah. Yeah, I had to put that into words, so yeah. With global warming, if you can power a car with liquid nitrogen, you can use the cold to create air conditioning and the power to drive the car. And that's what I'm working on at the moment. It might not work, so you know, I don't want to say too much about it. I know it will, but tried lots of inventions, but they usually fail because until you look into it, you don't know, do you, what the future holds. People used to think I was mad, and it's very difficult to get people to take notice of somebody who's working on their own in their shed. You know, you're a lone inventor, you haven't got the resources that big institutions have got with thousands of people working on things. Well, most people think, well, if it was any good, the idea, it would already have been done. That's quite common. There's so many problems in the world. The more minds that we can put to it, more people that can work on them, even if it's only on their own in their shed, you can make a difference.
Right, here's the challenge. How do we build and heat our homes without overheating the planet?
Net zero.
Net zero.
Net zero.
So net zero is the plan, but how are we actually going to get there? Because our buildings are responsible for 28% of total CO2 emissions. And when you add in emissions from building those buildings, that number goes up to 39%. So how on earth are we getting to net zero? Luckily, scientists and experts have been working for years on this. I've been speaking with some of them and going through the advice and evidence of many more. And one thing is definitely clear. We're gonna have to do something about our buildings.
Especially how we heat them.
Heat is around half of the energy that's used around the world, half. And the emissions from heating are about a third overall. Gas is by far the biggest way that we produce heat, not just in the UK, but around the world. In the UK, we are a particularly gassy country. About 85% of homes are connected to the gas grid. There are about 23 million homes with gas boilers. And while gas is slightly cleaner than burning oil or burning coal, it's still a fossil fuel. So it's all got to go.
Right, so swap out 23 million boilers. There's a little bit of a logistical challenge there, but more importantly, what are we going to replace these with?
There is an idea that you could just convert the existing gas grid to run on hydrogen. That would be piped into people's homes and then burnt in boilers, much the same way it is now. But burning hydrogen for heat looks like an extremely expensive and inefficient option.
Right. What else could we do then?
It looks like heat pumps will be the cheapest long-term option for most people.
So a heat pump, as the name suggests, it pumps heat from the air, the ground, or even rivers and the sea into your home.
A gas boiler might be 80 or 85% efficient, but a heat pump will give you about 3.5 units of energy for every unit of energy you put into it. So that's 350% efficiency. They're just so much more efficient than a boiler will ever be.
Sounds a bit like a no-brainer, but there's still a few hurdles to overcome because heat pumps are still pretty expensive. And putting them in can be a complex operation, maybe requiring new radiators and insulation.
It shouldn't be a personal responsibility. There should be help for people to do this. So it's the role of government to make this really easy for people. You should be able to phone up an advice line and be offered grant funding or offered a free or low-cost loan and be able to do this at no upfront cost and no upfront hassle to yourself.
The reality is that anything like that seems pretty far away. And in 2019, the UK's Climate Change Committee
said that over 10 years after the Climate Change Act was passed, there is still no serious plan for decarbonising UK heating systems.
So yeah, still some huge challenges to overcome for these to be a viable option in our homes. And of course, that's just one aspect of making our buildings net zero friendly. There's still things to think about like electricity and insulation, but this is all just about our buildings as they are. What about building? Constructing our homes.
Because at the same time, the global population is still rising, and that means the need for new housing and the materials to build it with is going to rise too, specifically concrete.
Concrete is the most widely used material on the planet after water.
In 3 years, China consumed more cement, the glue that holds concrete together, than the US used in the entire 20th century. And if cement production were a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitter in the world. And that's a lot to do with the production of clinker, the key part of cement. Because turning the raw materials, mainly limestone and clay, into calcium oxide produces a lot of CO2, just part of the process. And producing concrete also uses a huge amount of water. In 2050, an estimated 75% of this water will likely be taken from regions that won't have enough to satisfy human needs.
So how do we reduce its environmental impacts?
Everyone might think that the best way to do it would be using less concrete. But that will also bring quite a lot of social inequalities because we need infrastructure for living.
So other options include recycling concrete and waste CO2, reducing the amount of clinker, or swapping it for other materials. And there's even self-healing concrete with bacteria in it that responds automatically to cracks.
In 2021, cement makers around the world did pledge to cut emissions by up to 25% by 2030 to reach net zero by 2050. So that's some ambition being shown, but we have to interrogate this a little bit further because that plan relies on carbon capture. And there's 2 things with that. Firstly, it could make concrete much more expensive. Who's paying for that? And number 2,
we still need to answer the questions of what are we going to do with that CO2 once it's under storage.
So in order for the industry to transition to low carbon, it's not just technology that we need.
There are many things that could be done just now, but we don't have the right policy or the right standards that enable us to actually adopt it rapidly into practice. Concrete is a material that we take for granted. We think, oh, it's not sophisticated, it's not beautiful, so it might not be interesting. But when we think about the vast amount of concrete that we actually use in our society, we need all hands in deck to try to make this material more sustainable, more efficient, so we can continue using it for the many years to come to resolve our infrastructure needs.
Okay, we've only just scratched the surface of these 2 huge topics, but when it comes to net zero, there's a lot of chat about things we need to cut in our lives, but there's a lot of positives too, especially when it comes to our buildings.
So a dream outcome for me in 2050 is that we're all living in houses that are warmer, quieter, cozier, and cheaper to run, and we've met our climate change targets. That would just be fantastic.
Grown all over these mountains is one of the weirdest plants you'll ever see. It's a strange type of giant maize that grows up to 20 feet tall. These disconcerting finger-like things are its roots, suspended meters off the ground, and they ooze with a gooey mucus. And it's this mysterious mucus that could help feed the planet and end farming's toxic reliance on chemical fertilizers.
This is the Holy Grail.
As long as scientists can crack its code. This is the town of Totontepec in southern Mexico. For centuries, possibly even millennia, this maize has been meticulously cared for by the indigenous farmers there.
Nos contaron nuestros antepasados, nuestros abuelos, que pues el maíz lleva mucho más de 2000 años. Empecé a cultivar de los 13 años. Jugábamos con esa gelatina que daba pues la raíz desde muy pequeño, pues no sabíamos qué tenía o por qué se le salía. Para nosotros significa mucho, nuestra semilla es bueno, no tienen otros pueblos o otros países como de nosotros.
But word about this mysterious giant corn eventually reached the ears of curious scientists. One of those was Howard Yana Shapiro, who was living in Oaxaca all the way back in 1980.
I hear they have giant maize. So the word giant maize, kind of intrigued me. The maize that was growing was 16 to 18 feet tall. You know, a normal maize that you see across America might be 8 to 10 feet tall, but this was gigantic. I just couldn't believe it. Seeing something that was mythical. And in many ways, it was mythical. On the surface of the roots, in a period when a maize plant would need nitrogen for that explosive growth, there was a mucilaginous material, really thick, very viscous. And we would watch it, and it would auto-dose itself, essentially.
And this mucus appeared to be allowing the plant to self-fertilize, meaning the farmers barely needed to add any artificial fertilizer.
The idea that a maize plant could make its own nitrogen sounded like science fiction to virtually everyone we talked to.
And to understand the reason why, you're going to have to get used to a very important term.
Nitrogen fixation, nitrogen fixation, nitrogen fixation.
Nitrogen is essential to all plants. It's a major component of all proteins and chlorophyll. We're literally surrounded by nitrogen. The air is 78% nitrogen. Great. Except it's not. Because almost all plants apart from legumes can't convert this lovely nitrogen from the atmosphere into the ammonia that it can actually use. And the reason this is such high stakes is about way more than corn. The world's population is literally fueled by cereal grains. Wheat, corn, rice, sorghum, millet, barley. These make up more than 50% of the world's diet, and none of them can fix their own nitrogen. So we spray huge amounts of nitrogen-rich fertilizer to plug the gap. Great for delivering bigger yields and helping to feed the planet's 8 billion people. Terrible for the environment.
Unfortunately, most plants, when we apply the fertilizer, only take up about half of it.
It pollutes the water table. There's huge eutrophic sections of the Gulf of Mexico, which are dead zones caused by nitrogen.
And that's not all. Fertilizer isn't cheap, so in some parts of the world, farmers can't even use fertilizers at all, meaning lower yields and less food to feed people.
Wouldn't this be great if you didn't have to apply nitrogen in ammonia form? Wouldn't it be great if this impacted the production in the global south where they don't have access to fertilizer particularly? Hell yes. So you have a scientific motivation, you have an ecological motivation, you have a financial motivation. All of these come together when you try to solve a systematic problem.
So, that's the prize. But it's time to go back to Mexico. Mexico is the birthplace of corn, home to more than 50 varieties. But the one with the ability to fertilize itself is called olaton. And even in Mexico, this remained a relatively well-kept secret for centuries. When Howard first came across it in 1980, it still took him nearly 30 years to get the right team together to study it.
So we started working with the community. We started doing all the kind of research. Let's establish facts. And we engaged the community extensively. We built a lab there. We had people from the community actually working for us.
Together with Mexican scientists and the town of Totontepec, they studied how this slimy musogel helps the plant to self-fertilize and grow so tall. They found that it's packed with nitrogen-fixing bacteria usually found in the soil. The gel itself acts like a sort of shield, creating a low-oxygen environment that allows the bacteria to convert atmospheric nitrogen into a form the plant can actually use. This allows the plant to take up to 80% of the nitrogen it needs directly from the air. Finally, after a decade of research, there was proof of the agricultural holy grail, a self-fertilizing cereal crop. But almost immediately, some people started to ask, who owns the rights to an amazing plant like this? Some even went much further, labeling it as an example of what's known as biopiracy.
So biopiracy is basically the idea that there is a misappropriation of biodiversity for research or the development of commercial products. And I always talk about this by thinking about Indiana Jones, right? So the idea that then, somebody could swoop in to, biodiversity-rich country, take a few plants, swoop out, and discover the cure for cancer, and make a lot of money. And and it was that was a happy ending, right? Well, wrong. And a lot of countries are saying, actually, this biodiversity is located within our countries, and it's intrinsically linked to the culture and lifestyles of a lot of our indigenous peoples and local communities.
So what does all this mean when it comes to olaton?
In Mexico, an agreement was negotiated between a company and a local community in a way to secure prior informed consent for this research, and also to agree on sharing some of the potential benefits.
Every time that one seed is sold, half the value of the royalty goes to the community.
Para mí es bueno porque de ahí aprendemos que el maíz de nuestro pueblo es el mejor del mundo, porque últimamente no lo sabíamos, como tanto nosotros como ellos también aprenden, porque vienen a investigar acá muchas cosas y es bueno pues tener algo, que nos den algo.
The village has been instrumental. We could have never done what we've done without them. They've been all in the whole way.
It's fair to say that some are still definitely wary, especially because the agreement itself remains confidential. But in a way, all of this only matters if this scientific marvel can actually deliver on its promise, because it's not made any money just yet. Because for all the tantalizing promise of this self-fertilizing corn, farmers aren't going to grow it on a massive scale unless it can compete with current industrial scale corn. So researchers are currently crossbreeding it with other varieties, hoping to transfer some of its unique properties. They've already managed to almost halve the amount of time it takes to grow, and they've made huge progress on fixing nitrogen too.
We can now fix about 40% of the nitrogen from the air, from just the local bacteria in the fields in the United States. So this plant is recruiting the bacteria to fix nitrogen from the air, and 40% is a good amount.
Probably 3 or 4 generations away from a stabilized hybrid maize.
But the future of this is not just about corn.
So now the scenario is nitrogen fixing maize, nitrogen fixing rice. What's next? Wheat. Then let's do millet, which is used in many parts of the world. How about barley? All of that is open now for discussion.
In a perfect world, all crops would fix their own nitrogen, and we would reduce the amount of fertilizer that we need.
So the future for nitrogen-fixing cereal crops is looking bright.
Hopefully in my lifetime, nitrogen-fixing maize commercially available around the world.
But in our increasingly monocultural world, the fact that a little-known maize from a misty mountain in rural Mexico has been kept alive by small-scale indigenous farmers and could now help tackle world hunger points to another inescapable thing.
We cannot talk about biodiversity as something separate than people. People use biodiversity, people care for biodiversity, people depend on biodiversity. And, the idea that there is this wealth of knowledge and possibilities around biodiversity is really such a wonderful connection between people and nature. And we must find a way to be able to tap into this potential in a way that we are all benefiting.
Because as much as the science is amazing, it's equally amazing that it's only thanks to this small community in the mountains of Oaxaca who have preserved this rare plant with such care that we're even able to get excited about it at all.
Okay, here's the challenge. Feed 2 billion more people,
but with less land and fewer emissions.
Net zero.
Net zero.
Net zero.
So we've all heard the term, but what does it mean when it comes to our food? Are we going to eat different things? And what will our land look like?
It turns out the way we feed the world is bad for the planet. It produces 35% of all of our greenhouse gas emissions. And by 2050, there'll be an estimated 2 billion more mouths to feed.
Right, so how on earth do we get to net zero?
This is Morgan Gillespie. She's director of the Food and Land Use Coalition at the World Resources Institute. So meeting her feels like a good place to start.
There's problems of distribution, access, and there's problems with marketing and consumption. Are we making the kinds of food that we should be consuming that's good for our human health and for our planetary health? But across all of those things, there's a lot of food that's being produced today that's wasted. If we continue business as usual, it's likely that we're going to need 400 million more hectares of land to feed our growing population. That's an area twice the size of Mexico.
Right. So we have a pretty inefficient system then. We do produce enough food to feed everybody, but we don't distribute it evenly and we waste far too much of it. But it turns out it could also be more efficient in the way that it's produced to begin with.
Because agriculture uses about 70% of all fresh water, which is becoming a more and more precious resource. So we're going to have to learn to make more with less.
Luckily, there are some pretty exciting innovations already.
Like vertical farming. Crops don't have to be grown above ground or even in soil. And by carefully controlling the conditions, vertical farms can produce more food with less water and less space.
Technical innovation is one of many tools that we need to help the transformation of the food and land use systems.
Okay, surely you knew this was coming. It's time to talk about meat.
90% of deforestation globally is driven from agriculture. It's primarily beef.
And meat doesn't just take up land. A 2021 study found that nearly 60% of all emissions from food come from meat. That's everything from methane burped by cows to the emissions generated to produce our animals' food. So what does that mean for the food on our plates?
We don't want everyone to shift to a plant-based diet. What we should be considering is a reduction of beef consumption, particularly in global north, by as much as 2/3. And that sounds really scary to a lot of people. But by doing that, that enables folks who are currently suffering from malnutrition or undernutrition due to poverty to increase their meat consumption so that they reach healthy and sustainable levels of protein.
But it's not just what we eat that we need to be mindful of.
Soy is the second big driver of deforestation. Timber, to a lesser degree, and then palm oil. And palm oil is like the silent killer. It's in shampoo, it's in lipstick, it's in chocolate bars.
Right, so then how do we stop deforestation?
Everyone in the system has a role to play. Governments have a role to play in setting and implementing strong policy. Companies can think more critically about the types of food they're producing. They can think about sharing their profits more equitably across their supply chain. And then we as people have some agency as well. We can choose, for example, to reduce our meat consumption. And the fact that you will start purchasing less meat will send a demand signal to the companies to know that they can stop selling so much meat, which reduces pressure on the environment. The second voice you have is with your vote, and that's an equally impactful driver of action.
So how should we be using our land?
Rewilding is the large-scale restoration of ecosystems to the point where nature can take care of itself. Many of the world leaders have pledged that 30% of our land and seas will be dedicated to nature's recovery by 2030. If we were to rewild 30% of Britain with a combination or a mixture of peatlands and heathlands and woodlands and species-rich grasslands, for instance, it could have a significant impact on pulling carbon out of the atmosphere.
Okay, so could we just plant lots of trees to offset all of our CO2?
Well, different people have different figures, but according to an Oxfam report, 1.6 billion hectares of land would be needed. That's 5 times the size of India, or all the farmland on the planet.
We don't want rewilding to be used as an excuse to carry on emitting carbon at the same level. We have to massively reduce our carbon emissions.
So what's the balance then, right, between rewilding and still producing enough food for everyone to eat?
In England alone, we have 350,000 hectares of golf courses. So there is a lot that you could rewild with minimal impact on the ability to produce food.
So there are still some big decisions to be made. And with food, more than anything else in net zero, we have a particular emotional connection to it. It's linked to our histories, to our cultures, which makes changing our attitudes to it particularly hard to navigate. But people's habits are changing. And it's easier to imagine change now more than ever.
What we want to aim for by 2050 is a world in which all people have access to healthy and nutritious food. We have the tools to do this. We know technically how to do it. We know politically how to do it. We can figure out the financing to make this happen, but we need all the players in the system to do this together. The idealized future is possible.
Turning plastic pollution into a building solution. My name is Nzambi Mate. I'm from Nairobi, Kenya, and we convert plastic waste into building bricks.
I hope I will look back and I will say I created a dent in the universe, even if it's just one plastic from the environment. In Kenya, we have plastic waste pollution problem, just like in the rest of the world. Here in Nairobi, we generate about 500 metric tons of plastic waste every single day. And only a fraction of that is recycled. In the same breath, we have a deficit of affordable housing units, about 2 million. And this number increases to 200,000 every single year. So, why don't you use this problem of plastic waste pollution and convert it into alternative, affordable building products? Hence, Kijenge was born. Kijenge Makers is an alternative building product manufacturing company, and our first product lines are Beavers, made out of recycled waste plastic.
We turn waste into wanted, one brick at a time. After you sort the plastic, you take it to the crusher, you crush it into small flakes, you mix it with sand, and then you feed it to an extruder where it mixes the plastic and the sand into oatmeal, like a dough-like material, and then you take that dough-like material, you feed it in the press, and then in maybe about 3 minutes, you have your brick. And that's how you make a brick. Building bricks are stronger, cheaper, and lighter. So they're stronger because they're made out of plastic, and plastic is polymerous in nature. It's like string-like in nature, and so when you bind with sand at high temperatures, it binds well. When you process it, it doesn't have a lot of air pockets, so it's less brittle, hence stronger. It's lighter, it's almost half the weight compared to the normal concrete, and it's cheaper, it's about 25% cheaper than the normal concrete. So yeah, that's our triple threat. So plastic bricks are more environmentally friendly than concrete bricks because of two main reasons. Number one, the sourcing of the materials. In plastic waste, it's more closer compared to the cement. And then number two, the CO2 emissions that emit due to the process of cement is more than that of plastic processing of the brick. Plastic waste is as a byproduct of refining the crude oil. How do we use that plastic over and over again until we extract its maximum value? At the same time, how do we reduce the CO2 emissions that come due to the construction space? I think it's time we figure out an alternative because these resources are not infinite, they are very finite. Once we make these bricks, we install them either in sidewalks, driveways, households, also footpaths. Big thing we're currently working on is building blocks, targeting the affordable housing space. We want to make a building. So currently right now we're in the research and development phase, but maybe hopefully in a month or so, sometime next year, inshallah, we'll have the prototype ready. Our goal is to provide a brick that we reduce the material cost by 30%, we reduce the CO2 emissions by about 20%, and the building time by half. If we get that, I think, inshallah, next year I'll be a happy woman. In the building space and in the construction space, we have done the same things over and over again. And my belief is it's time for us to disrupt this space. It's time we rethink. I think for me, pushing the boundaries and moving to the next development and the next solution is just a way of growth, you know? Because if you don't grow, then ideally speaking, that means you're dying. And the future we are going to and the future we are heading to, if we want to be sustainable, then we have to push the boundaries. We need to be keeping and pushing those innovations out there, testing them. Because you have two options. It either works or it doesn't. Either way, you learn something. I like saying I started Jijenge, it's like I jumped off a cliff without a parachute. So I was building the plane as I was falling. And some of the things worked, some of the things didn't work on the way, but at the end of the day, I got a fulfillment. My hope is, or rather my aim is where our existence as human beings is not mutually exclusive with sustainability, but rather it's one and the same thing. That is my hope and prayer. Well, up to now, we are almost heading to about 100 metric tons of plastic waste by the end of this year. Together with my team, we have been able to create job opportunities for about 113 youths and women here in Kenya, and that I am really proud of and happy. And my hope and prayer is to push to double that or triple that. We need to move and we need to build the future and build it fast. I feel honored and I feel like I'm in the front line of a battlefield. And it's us against creating a sustainable earth. And let's do this. For me, the awakening moment was in around 2017. I went to Coast and I went to the beach, and there was so much plastic just coming in and touching the legs. And for me, that was like a eureka moment. I was like, no, enough is enough. Something needs to change. I was tired of plastic everywhere.
And I was tired of complaining until it reached a point I was like, I need to be that someone. So I was just tired of sitting there in the sidelines. So I took action. That's when I started DJing. My purpose is to build a sustainable future, and in the context of actually building it literally in the space. My mission is to do that every single day, and to also do it with style. Yeah, to add some sauce to it, because sometimes when you're in the sustainability space, it takes time for you to see the impact, and for you to see the reaction. You need time, sometimes years. It makes work easy, and it makes work a bit fun if you realize what's your purpose. It might not come instantaneously, but it's a journey. It's like unwrapping a gift. The impact I hope to achieve, or I would want to achieve, is when my time on this earth is done, when I am almost my grandmother's age, I will look back and I will say I created a dent in the universe. The impact I did was I was able to extract, even if it's just one plastic from the environment, and converted it into something amazing, something beautiful, something sustainable. For me, that's my motivation, that's my drive. It started with me and my dream in my mom's backyard. And my hope and prayer is someone else will see the same thing, and they have a dream, they have a vision, and they want to build it. They will get the courage and the strength to do so.
Ah, coffee. The fuel that powers the global economy by keeping us awake through all that unpaid overtime. The medicine that gets you through a meeting with your boss while horrendously hungover. Basically, you know it will always be there when you need it. Except, what if it's not? Because here's the thing, coffee is going extinct. A combination of global warming, pests, and a nasty fungus called coffee leaf rust are threatening coffee as we know it. More than 60% of the world's wild coffee species are expected to be wiped out by 2050. But there's hope, in the form of a long-lost little bean recently rediscovered in the wild in Sierra Leone. It's called Coffea stenophila, although it depends who you ask in terms of how to pronounce it.
And it's called Coffea stenophila.
Stenophilia. I've been told that's incorrect.
Or stenophila.
And there's also talk of another wild bean in Uganda, Coffea liberica, that's also promising to help fight back against climate change. And it's just as well, because the world is hooked on coffee. About 2 billion cups of coffee are consumed around the world every single day. It's an industry worth an estimated $500 billion, supporting some 100 million coffee farmers.
Coffee is an extremely global crop. It is a major export for about 25 countries, meaning the income that a country earns from coffee exports might help pay for roads and hospitals.
Here's the thing with coffee. There are some 130 known species of coffee in the world, but all of that delicious elixir floating through our veins every day comes from basically just 2 types of bean.
Coffea arabica and Coffea canephora, which we also commonly call Robusta.
For coffee snobs, Arabica is basically seen as the nice tasting one you'd buy at an overpriced coffee shop, and Robusta usually ends up blended into instant coffee. And it's Arabica, the nicer tasting one, that's suffering most with climate change.
It is very susceptible to diseases and pests, and it also has kind of a narrower environmental pocket that it thrives in.
Arabica is hypersensitive to rising temperatures, and this is already having a massive impact on coffee farmers right now.
Arabica is going to continue to decline in production. Farmers are facing more pressure from diseases, pests, and weather, and they need a plant that is more tolerant.
So that's why people have started to reconsider some of the other 100 or so species of wild coffee, looking for help. And there was one person who kept coming up in basically every conversation I had.
If you have spoken to Aaron Davis,
Speak with Aaron Davis.
Aaron Davies.
So I went to Kew Gardens in London to speak to the man himself. How do you pronounce stenophila or phyla or stenophila?
It's Coffea stenophila.
There you go. Stenophila. Glad we got that one sorted. It used to be widely consumed around Europe in the 19th and early 20th century.
It was successful, it did pretty well for a number of years, and then almost completely vanished overnight.
But reports about it from the time captured the imagination of Aaron and his team.
What they were saying is that the taste is excellent, and that it, in some cases, is better than Arabica. Now when you hear that, you start to get excited.
But even more intriguing was that it could withstand higher temperatures than Arabica and still survive.
So it's not a core tropical plant like Arabica, it occurs in the lowlands where it's hotter. And that starts to pose some questions around, could it be useful climate change adaptation?
And if that wasn't enough,
there are accounts of it being resistant to coffee leaf rust. And coffee leaf rust is the worst disease of coffee. It annihilates countries. It causes farmers to go bankrupt very, very quickly. It's a terrible, terrible disease. If that were the case, that would be a big tick in the box for Stenophylla.
Amazing. Problem solved. Except no one knew for sure that it wasn't already extinct. One of the only known existence of it were these samples right here, dried out and stuck to an old piece of paper from the 19th century. That sample right there in my hands is from the 1870s and was the biggest stash anyone knew about. So how do you find a long lost species that might not even exist? Well, Aaron and his team had to turn detective. They tracked down the last known sightings of it to some forests in Sierra Leone, but even some of the forests didn't exist anymore. So no luck there.
And that turned up absolutely nothing.
So they set off on foot into the surviving forest, hoping they'd get lucky.
I mean, were you literally just going off hoping for the best?
My job as a person that knows wild species is to find that plant in the forest. Because when you go into that forest, there's just many hundreds of plant species, it's dark. So you have to identify just from its leaves, which is quite tricky.
And then eventually, they found one.
We often say that if we were doing this in 10 years' time, there might be a chance that it would actually be extinct in Sierra Leone.
Now I turned up to Kew Gardens hoping to sample some of this mysterious coffee for myself, but as it turns out, I never stood a chance. So valuable is just the potential of this wonder bean to an industry worth $500 billion that Kew Gardens can't keep it on the premises in any significant quantity because of the fear of bioespionage.
The demand is so great for people wanting to grow this coffee outside of Africa or in other parts of Africa that we have to be very careful not to pass it on to other countries. But we also know that people have tried to steal this coffee.
This idea of people stealing it, is that from here, from Sierra Leone?
I can't share any details of the nefarious recent history of Stenophylla, but we do know that attempts have been made to visit Sierra Leone and acquire the beans from illegal sources. I mean, our hope and our aspiration is that we can use Stenophylla to benefit the country where it's found. They're the countries and communities that should be benefiting from this natural biological resource.
So with good reason, I wasn't able to verify how good it tastes. But when this coffee was tasted by industry experts, it passed with flying colours. And that only adds to its allure as a potential saviour of the coffee industry. Okay, so how do we get from a promising little magic bean into actually transforming a multi-billion-dollar global industry? Farmers aren't just going to switch over to a new bean on a whim. So the next step for Aaron and his partners is a trial project, where they pay farmers in Sierra Leone to grow it and see how it performs, guaranteeing the farmers income while they continue their research. But that's not the only thing going on with it.
Many people see this as the wonder bean, and it ticks nearly every box that you would need from a really good coffee crop plant, but the yields are quite low. So what we see is that initially it will become a high value niche crop for those people that are really into coffee, the real coffee geeks. But our aspiration is to use Stenophylla in a breeding program to develop something that's commercially scalable.
So that's where we are with Stenophylla for now. An exciting, possibly game-changing prospect, but still some way off totally transforming the coffee industry. But if just one of these wild species offers such promise, what about the other 130 or so? Because it turns out Stenophylla isn't the only wild species that is offering hope of salvation. This is Catherine Kawuka. She's based in Uganda, where coffee makes up a crucial part of the economy.
Uganda is gifted in terms of coffee.
She's been researching another of those wild species, one called Coffea liberica, also known as excelsa. And here something really exciting is happening because farmers are already switching over to using it of their own accord.
It is a farmer-led initiative because they do experience these challenges. The drought spells are very intense and more frequent. So when drought hits, you're seeing farmers taking a decision to uproot all the Robusta coffee and plant more of Liberica coffee. It's quite resilient to drought, to common coffee pests and diseases, and also the yield is very, very promising. This species is the one that is sustaining our coffee production in such times when the droughts are intense and more frequent. This is our go-to species. The challenges we are seeing with climate change are asking us to rethink our coffee sector. Should we keep burdening it with only 2 species when we have a wealth of other species with full potential thriving in the world?
And that's what it really seems to come down to, preserving as much genetic diversity as possible, and maybe reinforcing the idea that actually we need to keep some of these around.
If you lose Stenophylla or if you lose Liberica or something else, then you lose an option.
Some of the genetic diversity that is in some of these wild species there may be some really useful traits kind of hiding in these plants that may help us solve future problems. For example, like resistance to a disease that is not really known yet or really widespread on coffee farms. The potential for that might be in one of those 130 species. So we don't want to lose it, right? Once it's gone, it's gone.
But with such promise being shown by just 2 of the wild species that were previously slipping towards extinction, hopefully we might now do a better job of keeping the gene pool as biodiverse as possible and keeping our coffee flowing for good.
We need to talk about waste. Every year, we throw out a huge amount of stuff, about 2 billion tons. Let's break that down a bit. 1 rubbish truck load of clothing is burnt or dumped in landfill every second.
I don't know how long this video will end up being, but by the end, at least 300 more trucks of clothing waste will have been dumped. And electronics are no better.
The weight of all our binned electronics is more than the weight of all commercial airliners ever made.
Food?
If you loaded our food waste onto 40-ton trucks and parked them bumper to bumper, those 23 million trucks would circle the Earth 7 times. And the weight of all our plastic waste is roughly equal to the weight of the entire human population.
I could go on, but you get the picture. We waste a lot.
And it produces a whopping 1.6 billion tons of CO2 every year.
To get to net zero, clearly something needs to change.
And if we're going to change our approach to waste, there are 2 main routes: waste less or recycle what we waste more. Let's start with recycling. We all think, well, I've put my stuff into the right bin, great, job done, right? But the problem is when we zoom out and look at the system as a whole. Take plastic, it's everywhere, even places you really don't expect it. Like a tin can. Eroding the aluminium shows that this can is not actually all can. Even it has a plastic layer inside, and we have a really bad record of recycling it.
Since we started producing plastic, about 8.3 billion tons of plastic has been produced. About 76% of this has become waste.
Only 9% of that waste was recycled. Actually, virtually all plastic can be recycled, but collecting it, sorting it, melting it is expensive and complicated. And in the UK, we send a lot of our waste overseas to deal with, about 2/3 of it.
We don't actually know what happens to all of this. And according to a report by the UK's National Audit Office, some of it could be sent to landfill. So not as squeaky clean as we'd like to think. And the plastic that actually is recycled?
PET is the most recyclable plastic that we know at the moment. And even that you can only recycle it 8 times.
8 times? If current trends continue, about 12 billion tons will be sent to landfill or littering the natural world by 2050.
Okay, that's the bleak but necessary part. Now we can be a bit more optimistic because experts around the world are working on solutions.
AI robots are helping us recycle quicker and more efficiently. We found that bugs like common waxworms can nibble through plastic, breaking it down, and other scientists are using plastic-eating enzymes found in fungi and bacteria.
If you think about a brewery making a beer, so instead of putting in the hops, it's plastic, and instead of your yeast, you're putting in this type of microorganism that can digest it, then you'll come out with the soup of monomers that could be used to make new plastic.
So there are some really exciting innovations out there, but to tackle the massive scale of the problem, clearly something else has got to give. I'm not saying don't recycle, still very important, but what if we reduce the amount of waste we produced to begin with?
So here's the problem. We've inherited linear degenerative economies. We take Earth's materials, we turn them into something we want, use it often only once, and then we throw it away. So we have to transform this system to a circular, regenerative one. Everybody needs a drill every now and then, but we don't need it every day. So why not borrow it and loan it from the library like you would a book? In cities and towns all over the world, repair cafes are popping up. People who are frustrated that they can't fix their watch or their phone or their bike or their toaster, taking it to a repair cafe where there is somebody who has a spanner or knows how to take apart a computer and repair it. But the circular economy cannot be left to those grassroots initiatives. It has to be taken on board by industry. We need to put regulation in place that makes it happen.
So I have this drawer, right, full of old electronics, things like phones, which I end up replacing every 2 years or so. But why can't I just fix these? This isn't a technical flaw, it's not an accident, this is by design. And it has a name, planned or inbuilt obsolescence, and it's exactly what a law in France is trying to tackle.
It's called the Repairability Index, and it rates things on how repairable they are, which encourages companies to make their products last longer. And that's not just good for the wallet. Extending the lifetime of electronics in the EU by just 1 year would save around 4 million tons of carbon dioxide. And that's the same amount of CO2 as taking over 2 million cars off the roads for a whole year.
One of the ways that people individually have got hooked into the linear economy is through 100 years of consumer advertising that tries to convince us that we'll improve our lives every time we buy something new. We need to mimic what Earth has always done, which is reuse and repurpose and regenerate. And that's an incredibly exciting 21st century economic transformation.
So clearly there are some major changes needed to the way we deal with our waste, but it could be an opportunity to rethink our relationship to our stuff more generally. I think that's a parcel, actually. I needed this one.
Beavers are the ultimate climate warriors. That's why we call them ecosystem engineers. Their dams reduce flooding, prevent droughts, capture carbon, purify water, and increase biodiversity. But they've been extinct in Britain for 400 years. Until recently. Beavers totally transform the landscape, creating whole ecosystems from scratch. And here's how they do it.
Hi, I'm Heather Devi and I work with beavers in Northern England. Now at the moment we're at the Lowther estate near Penrith in the Lake District because last year they released 2 beavers into an enclosure as part of an enclosed trial release. And what has been brilliant is I've been coming to this site for the past year to monitor the impacts the beavers have had. And let me tell you, it is incredible. So it's all part of the estate returning the landscape to nature, giving over a little bit of control so that nature takes its own route and still continuing farming on the estate as well. Beavers and humans actually co-evolved, and in Britain we coexisted with beavers right up until around 400 years ago. And we actually hunted beavers to extinction in the first place for their meat, for their fur, particularly for the hat industry. But instead of looking to the past, now we're looking to the future and how we can once again learn to live alongside beavers.
Here we are at our first beaver feature, and where better to start than with a beaver dam. Now beavers are stimulated to create dams because they need around 1 meter's depth of water to feel secure. If they don't have that, they'll chop down some trees, they'll take the upper branches, and then they'll pull it into the water system and pack it in with mud and stones. And that's exactly what the Lowther pair did when they first arrived. Admittedly, this dam is a little bit humble, but from where it started in October last year, it's really increased in height and in length. And that's the brilliant thing about beaver dams. Beavers actually respond really quickly to changes in the environment, so they work with the water table. If rains increase, they might increase the height of dam, they might add a notch to let water through occasionally, but
overall prerogative of beavers is to hold water back. And to do that, they don't just create one dam, they create a really complex network within a wetland, and that creates a really dynamic ecosystem. That is why beavers are known as ecosystem engineers. They create these ecosystems entirely from scratch, and they do it for free. Not only do these beaver dams actually benefit beavers, they help with biodiversity overall, so birds benefit, fish benefit, small mammals, amphibians, freshwater invertebrates, a whole diversity of life.
The wetlands beavers create, along with the silt that builds up behind dams, become massive carbon sinks. Wetlands are actually the most important habitat for carbon sequestration and could be our secret weapon for fighting climate change.
And us included, because if you listen carefully, that trickling of water shows that the flow of water is going really slow through this beaver dam. And when it's a complex network of dams like this, it helps to slow the flow of water downstream. Some sites have actually found a 30% reduction in peak flow rates because of beaver dams, which is no bad thing.
Other studies have found a 60% reduction. This is really important because it means that during storm events or heavy rains, the flow of water is slowed down by the complex network of dams, protecting what's downstream, for example, towns or villages. This holding back and slowing of water through the dam systems has another benefit. It helps filter out any potential harmful chemicals that can run into the waterways from agricultural fields or urban areas.
Now, any self-respecting engineer needs a really good toolkit, and beavers come fully equipped. That's because they've been evolving this aquatic rodent lifestyle for millions of years. For example, they've got a rudder-like tail and webbed hind feet to help aid with their swimming. On top of that, their nostrils close with their dive, as do their ears, and a part of their mouth to prevent water from entering their bodies when they dive underwater. But there's another anatomical feature that really comes in handy when we go and have a look at this second feature. So, on to beaver feature number 2, and that is felled trees. Now, if you're in a beaver habitat, you're very likely to see these. Not only do the beavers need them to create their dams, they actually switch to a woody diet in the winter. Because beavers are herbivores, they eat vegetation and these woody trees as well. They don't eat anything else like fish. So when beavers actually coppice a tree, they need that other anatomical feature, and of course that's their front teeth, their incisors. And if you've seen beaver teeth before, they're really bright orange, and that's because they're fortified with iron, really strong tools for the job of chopping through wood. Now, when the Lowther beavers arrived, this is the first tree that they actually set to work on coppicing. And as you can see, just after a year, there's a huge amount of regrowth. It grows back as a bit of a shrubby underlayer, which is brilliant for invertebrates, brilliant for small mammals, and really great as well for nesting birds, because this shrubby habitat is actually quite rare to come by when it comes to succession in these kinds of habitats, the wetlands. So let's head on to their transport networks to create these systems, and that is feature number 3. Now, the third feature that not many people are aware of that beavers create are channels, and they create these by digging them out with their forefeet. And these are brilliant networks for other species too, such as amphibians and fish. Now, when it comes to fish and beavers, it's been shown that beaver pools actually greatly benefit fish mass and diversity in age. So these networks actually act as transport channels for wildlife, but also for the beavers to drag their building materials through. Of course, beaver impacts are going to vary according to each site, and in some situations we will need to work with them, such as installing tree guards to protect trees, or putting flow devices through dams to alter the height of water. But with enclosed trial releases and free-living beavers around parts of Britain now, it's really important that we work together to welcome back nature's ally to join our battle against the impacts of climate change and the biodiversity crisis.
What do you think the future will look like? This? This? Or will it look something like this? Climate change is transforming the way we think about the designs of our cities. We're typically used to thinking of the future as a shiny concrete jungle, but this is looking less and less likely, at least not until we've solved a huge problem first. This stuff. Concrete. The foundation of, well, foundations. Concrete has a lot going for it. It's cheap, reliable, and so easy to use that basically anybody can be taught to work with it. So it's no surprise it became the defining architectural feature of the last century. So whether you're a fan of brutalism or you just think architects have actually been walling us in a concrete prison, either way, concrete is a really useful material. Problem is, it's threatening the future of our planet because of its absolute dependency on fossil fuels.
You couldn't possibly make it on anything like this scale without enormous fossil fuel inputs.
So the search is on for alternative materials that can offset concrete's carbon footprint. And while looking ahead to the future, many are actually delving into the past for inspiration. But one thing does seem certain.
We cannot build in concrete and steel any longer.
So what exactly is so bad about concrete?
Concrete is a big part of the problem. It's around 8% of all carbon emissions at the moment.
These emissions are largely caused by one ingredient, cement. While cement makes up just about 10 to 15% of concrete's total mass, it accounts for up to 90% of its greenhouse gas emissions. But despite this huge carbon footprint, we're making massive quantities of this stuff.
The total amount of cement we make on the planet every year at the moment would require you to cover an area of the size of Australia in woodland.
But with a global population of nearly 8 billion and an anticipated rise of 2 billion more over the next 30 years, the demand for housing, and by proxy concrete, is only getting larger.
In the 3 years of its peak building boom of around 2013, China used more concrete by a long way than America had used in the entire 20th century.
And that's the central conundrum of concrete. Whilst it's contributing massively to the rise in global temperatures, it's also difficult to find a sustainable alternative capable of building on such a scale. But one possible solution, a material that's both recyclable and plentiful, might be just beneath our feet. Mud. Mud brick construction has been around for centuries, but perhaps surprisingly, many of these old earth architecture structures are still standing firmly today, such as this, the Djinjerba Mosque in Timbuktu, Mali. Erected in 1327 and built almost entirely using materials such as fibre, straw and wood, and still standing today. It's a prime example of the durability of earth building. But how exactly does this method work?
So earth building is a historic traditional technique, and it's all about using some kind of soil in buildings. For the most part, that means subsoil. So that's getting into the mineral bit of the soil. There's always going to be some clay within that subsoil because clay is the sticky binder that holds everything together.
The clay can then be easily moulded into different shapes for use in the walls, making it totally cement-free, and meaning it has drastically lower carbon emissions. But rammed earth also has another trick up its sleeve. It's excellent at regulating both temperature and air quality, keeping the inside cool in the summer and warm in the winter.
Clay is a hygroscopic material, so it likes to take in moisture. When there's a lot of moisture in the atmosphere, it's absorbed into anything that's made of clay and then slowly released later. So it has this beautiful effect on humidity in any part of the house where it levels it off.
This makes rammed earth a potentially attractive prospect when it comes to small residential units. But what about skyscrapers and high-rise flats? Can this ancient technique be unified with modern architecture? Well, the answer is complicated. There are stunning examples of earth architecture being utilised for tall buildings, such as the Yemeni town of Shibam, which was largely constructed in the 16th century and is sometimes referred to as the oldest skyscraper city in the world. Some of the buildings in this city of mud are over 30 feet high, and the fact they're still standing some 500 years later shows just how durable earth architecture can be. But unfortunately, this ancient material faces an equally ancient adversary: water.
So where we might get a problem is, say if we had a leaking gutter where there's constant water coming through, then eventually that little bit of water tracking through can break down the walls and you can get bits of collapse that way.
In Shibam, this water damage is mitigated by routinely applying fresh coats of mud, but this method of preservation is better suited to warmer climates. Not so much the constant rain that is typical of European cities, meaning the maintenance of large-scale structures may not be so viable. So to build our future skyscrapers, we may need to turn to a different material: timber.
We need to think really carefully about how we can change the way in which we build. The technology exists, the materials are there, so this is an opportunity to really make a big difference relatively quickly.
This is Andrew Waugh, who's designed the office group's black and white building, which is made entirely of timber. Standing at just over 58 foot high, it's the tallest mass timber building in central London.
So you can see from this building, each one of these wall panels arrives on site millimetre perfect. So we're not throwing anything away at this building site. There are no big skips full of rubbish outside. And in the UK, about 50% of our landfill is just from construction.
And the key advantage of timber is that it's regenerative.
You can grow more of it. So it's not an extractive process. We're not scraping something off the surface of the planet, of the Earth, which we will never be able to put back. Every tree that's cut down, 5 are put back in its place.
Now you might be wondering about fire safety, and that's something that's certainly not lost on timber architects either, both the actual risk and the public perception.
One of the primary issues that we face is a concern around fire, and we work very closely with fire engineers, with different research departments globally, so that we're really careful about how we instill those in our buildings. And I live in a timber building on the 7th floor with my family. This is very close to me, ensuring that the buildings that we build are safe.
Timber seems like a genuinely exciting and viable solution to the future of how we build our cities. But there is a limitation. It's not going to replace concrete entirely, not least for major infrastructure projects.
We will probably always need concrete, for the infrastructure, for bridges, tunnels, for the foundations of the buildings that we build. But we need to transform the industry to one that vastly reduces the amount of carbon that it emits.
The central issue all comes back to concrete. As long as it remains the cheapest, strongest, fastest and most versatile building material, which it is, we're not going to eliminate it entirely. So what if we don't have to abandon it altogether? What if instead there was a way to recycle it and make it more sustainable? And that's exactly what Dr. Pippa Horton has been working on.
So I've got here a piece of one of the very first batches of cement that we produced. And how we make this is you take old concrete and you separate out from the concrete the aggregate and the sand, and what you're left with is old cement. And in order to turn that cement into new cement, it needs to be heated at very high temperature. We're using an electric arc furnace, which is a really hot furnace used for melting metal. And we put our old cement paste into that equipment, heats it up and turns it back into new clinker. And then we get to process it and recast it into new cement.
Put simply, this means recycling the cement we have to produce new variants in an almost loop-like process. But with this cement being sourced predominantly from demolition waste, is there enough to make this viable?
So there's enough demolition waste at the moment that we could meet the needs of about a quarter to a half of global cement using this production process. So it couldn't completely replace it, but it would do a pretty good job of meeting some of those needs without emissions. We're aiming and we hope that this process can be completely carbon-free and we eliminate all the emissions. We think we could save 500 million tonnes of CO2 a year from doing this process if we did it at full scale, so perhaps a couple of % of global emissions, but they're really rule of thumb approximations.
Innovations like this, trying to transform concrete from within, could be the key to making the future of construction sustainable. But beyond reusing concrete, there's also the option of reusing the things we've already built. It's called retrofitting, which is repurposing buildings rather than tearing them down and replacing them with more concrete.
We have a very, very large stock of existing robust buildings. 80% of the buildings we'll have in 2050 are already up by a conservative estimate, and almost all of them are performing really badly in energy terms, so we need to sort them out. Sorting out an existing building is very much lower carbon in almost all cases than building a new one.
It's very unlikely there'll be a one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to concrete. So rather than our future cities looking like sci-fi utopias, or dystopias depending on your particular aesthetic, our future skylines are likely to look more like a collage, with exciting new innovations sitting alongside some of the surprisingly durable techniques from far back into human history. An exciting way to keep history visible, while also ensuring we don't demolish the future in our rush to keep building.
So here's a question. Can we travel more but pollute less?
Net zero.
Net zero.
Net zero.
Net zero.
We've all heard a lot about net zero, but what does it actually mean, especially when it comes to transport?
Because that already accounts for about 27% of all of the emissions in the UK. And actually those emissions are expected to grow by more than any other sector.
So how do we keep traveling on planes, trains, and cars and still reach net zero? Let's take this to the road first, because you probably already guessed that electric vehicles are going to play a massive part in net zero, but it's not just like we can wait till 2050 then suddenly switch over all at once.
Even if tomorrow every single person who bought a brand new car bought an electric one, it would still take 15 years before every single car driving around out there was electric.
Okay, there's a lot of things that are going to have to go right for that to happen, not least making them actually affordable for everybody. But let's just imagine for a sec that it does, right? And everybody's driving around in electric cars. You're on the motorway, the wind is in your hair, suddenly the battery is dying. Where is the charge point?
One of the big issues with electric vehicles, of course, is that up until quite recently, and still a little bit now, people have got to have lots of different plugs in the boot of their car in order to access the different charge points.
Even so, we could need 10 times the number of charge points we currently have. So from 21,000 to 210,000.
Yeah, that's one huge infrastructure requirement, but here's a bigger one for you.
Because the roads aren't just about cars. 98% of all of the stuff in the UK and food is transported by road freight. That means lorries. But relying on charge points and batteries for massive trucks just isn't feasible. So what about a different idea?
Connecting the heavy goods vehicles to overhead lines, like a train line. The vehicles would click into that when they got onto the motorway and click out of it and then just run on their fuel tank or their smaller battery for the local elements of their journeys.
It's an interesting idea, isn't it? Sort of like if a tram pulled up alongside you on the motorway. To electrify 65% of trucks in this way, we would need to lay cabling along around 5,000 miles of roads. So it's a big challenge. But right now, the main solution for passenger vehicles is still batteries, and even here, there's a whole bunch of problems to solve. So I'm heading to Imperial College in London to find out more.
The supply chain for lithium-ion batteries actually is very complex. You obviously need lithium, where most of the world's lithium comes from places like Chile and Argentina.
In the US, 79% of all lithium lies near Native American reservations.
We also need elements such as cobalt, where a lot of the world's cobalt comes from the Congo at the moment, where there are concerns about ethical mining. So we're starting to see drastic changes in the supply chain of materials, and one of the challenges is that the demand for batteries is currently outstripping how fast we can actually dig these things up.
Worst case scenario, we could run out of lithium before ever reaching net zero.
Right now, even though battery recycling makes a lot of sense, very few lithium-ion batteries are actually recycled, and actually taking a battery pack apart can be quite dangerous because these often are at several hundred volts.
Yeah, we don't have the answer to the lithium problem yet, but with so much emphasis on going electric for net zero, it's one of the biggest challenges we'll need to address. But let's just zoom out for a second, because transport is more than just roads, and it's more than just transporting humans. It's also about transporting our stuff.
So a massive 90% of all things, from cars to fridges to clothes, are transported by sea.
And in fact, if the shipping industry were a country, it would be the 6th largest emitter in the world. It's responsible for about 940 million tons of CO2 every single year.
So what ways can emissions be reduced from shipping? Here are 5 possible solutions. Number 1, slow steaming. Yes, just by slowing ships down, you can save fuel and drastically cut emissions. Number 2, change a ship's shape. This here is a delightfully named bulbous bow. It's pretty good for reducing drag. Number 3, use wind power. Yes, really. Making freighters look more like sailing boats is actually a thing, like this concept. Number 4, alternate fuels like hydrogen or biofuels, but some of those have their own issues. And number 5, decrease the number of ships.
So I guess we could consider sending a bit less stuff around the world, maybe making fewer purchases of things we almost certainly didn't need. And then of course, there's planes.
The most common way the aviation industry mitigate their carbon footprint is carbon offsetting. The problem is that through tree planting, we haven't physically got enough land to accommodate the number of trees that we would need to do that.
The thing with planes, right, is that they need to be as light as possible to be able to fly. And right now, batteries are just too heavy.
Kerosene, which is the current airline fuel, is very energy dense, and batteries currently can't compete against it.
So where does that leave us?
The big problem with aviation is that the solutions, the technical solutions, really aren't there. So this has to be about looking at the demand side of it.
So how much of this is actually about personal responsibility?
There's a real tension when it comes to net zero between what we as individuals should do, because every signal we make in terms of what we buy makes a signal, whether it's to a policymaker, a company or whatever, and that's really important. It's actually only about 15% of people in the UK who are responsible for 75% of the flights. There are big policy changes required to bring in something like a frequent flyers tax.
So this is where we are right now. It's obvious we need some major changes to the way we travel. The good news is that we've already taken a lot of these steps, but it's still a pretty long road ahead.
Aboriginal people have a knowledge system that is so complex and have a lot of answers for us and how we should better live with this planet into the future. We can't separate climate change from management of land. They both go hand in hand. I wasn't surprised to see the country go up that way in 2019 when those wildfires hit Australia. I wasn't surprised at all. The drought that we were going through over a number of years was just horrific. And on top of that, the landscape had not been managed. It was full of rubbish. It was a ticking time bomb. It's all about creating biodiversity. It's all about saving lives and respecting all the lives that live in those ecosystems. We apply one fire, a spot fire first in one place, and then the smoke will start to leak out and the animals will smell the smoke. And then they will start to act. The insects will start to climb the trees to get safe in the canopies. And the kangaroo and other animals will go to the next ecosystem, which isn't far and which won't burn because it's too green. And they know all this knowledge. They know where to go, all the animals. Snakes go underground and ants go under the logs and all these things happen. And then we have animals that come to the fire, like the hawks will fly in and dive down to catch some grasshoppers. And then we see the kookaburras coming in, sitting in the branches. And the owls come at night after the fire. And they come looking at nighttime, looking for something to eat as well. And when we apply that fire, it's a single fire in a circle. So it burns in a circle and it goes out like this. And when it burns like that, there's 360 degrees of escape for the animals. And because we're burning at that right time in those certain places, then the fire also burns very slowly. And even little spiders can get away and little insects can get away. Except we don't want the ticks to get away because they're so slow, and that's okay because we don't want to get bitten by ticks. But all the other insects, they all move, and sometimes you can't even see the bark of the trees because there's so many insects climbing up the trees, and it's just so beautiful to watch. And you get to see how so many thousands of lives are saved from burning the right way. The fire being so cool that it doesn't harm the canopy, very low fire that just creeps around the country, just cleaning up the mess, only burning where it needs to burn, leaving a design of mosaic design pattern in the landscape. The right temperatures for the seeds that belong in those soils, and then up come the fresh shoots of grasses straight away. We see green grass within a couple of days when we burn the right way in country. And in some cases, in a couple of weeks, you wouldn't even know we burnt that land because there's a carpet of green grass right across the landscape. So when we light the fire, we don't just, barge into the landscape and use a drip torch and put heaps of fire through the landscape. That's putting too much fire too quickly in the land. It's no good. So it's all about reading the land and understanding the land. It's the trees that tell us where to go and where to burn. And then from there we read the grasses to apply those fires in the right place at the right time. How Aboriginal people have worked that out over thousands of years is by reading the landscape. So there's all different timing through all the different ecosystems. Even though it might sound so simple, there's so many layers. So burning country is about food. It's not about hazard reduction. It's about making food for the animals, food for people. And when we are doing that, we have green, lush landscapes and not dried out and neglected landscapes. And by doing that, you gave the fire its rightful role, and which is a friend, which helps our landscape, improves our landscapes, and keeps us safe from wildfires. And that's what we need to work towards. When a land is healthy, it has more opportunity and more chance to deal with drought and other serious fires, wildfires and so forth. And that's been evident through traditional knowledge that has been done for thousands of years. Has been based on making the land healthy and protecting the trees and bringing up the right vegetation and the right soils and the right ecosystems. As humans, we've come less intelligent when it comes to connecting to our landscapes and to our natural environment. And when we look at the elders from before, like the old people, they were like walking encyclopedias. And my mentors were like encyclopedias. They had all this knowledge of the land and they had all this information. They even songs and dances and a whole culture that's connected to the landscape. And now we look at people today and they look at the land and have no idea what they're looking at. And that's alarming. Yet we're so intelligent when it comes to technology. We're so intelligent when people look at their phones and they can tap away and all these things. And we can do our maths and do our sums and read and all these things, but we've lost all this intelligence of knowing about our Mother Earth and the country and having a culture that's connected to that, that's healthy and educates us and around our responsibilities as people and how we play our role within the environment. That's all gone. And that's why we're in this trouble. We need to start to understand that we're a part of the problem, and we need to look at ourselves really very, very hard through the lens of the landscape. We're part of the problem, but also we're also the solution. We can't separate climate change from management of land. They both go hand in hand, and both are extremely important, and they are both connected as well and a result of each other. And that's why we need to see this holistically, and that's where traditional knowledge, is so important. We got to know who we are. We got to see that reflection of ourselves if we're going to change. And there's one thing that the land can do, and that is reflect who we are.
Imagine your dystopian future. A couple of overturned cars, crops can't grow, swarms of robots are the only signs of life. Pretty textbook Apocalypse 101. Except, what if it's not? What if those robots could be part of the solution to prevent global catastrophe? Robot bees. It's almost impossible to overstate the role that bees, actual bees, play in our world today. Nearly 75% of leading crops depend on animal pollination. Without them, we really would be heading for disaster. But bees have been in trouble for decades, mostly thanks to a toxic mix of habitat loss, pesticides, climate change, and disease.
The beekeepers across the United States have lost 45% of honeybee colonies only between April 2020 and April 2021. That's insane. Honeybees are responsible for the 1/3 of the crop we actually eat, right? So it's a big problem.
So in one sense, we're already in our dystopian future, and we need to find solutions. And for some, that means robot bees. Because in labs all over the world, the race is on to create robot bees capable of pollinating plants and revolutionizing agriculture as we know it. Even if it does still sound like a dystopian nightmare. But how realistic is it to make them in the first place? Because replicating what a bee does is a mammoth challenge. To pollinate a flower, a bee has to locate the flower, identify where the pollen is, navigate through all sorts of elements and obstacles, and then land delicately on the flower itself. That's a huge technological challenge, let alone cramming all that computing power into something as small as a tiny robot. But that's the task facing Chahat Singh at the University of Maryland.
We are at a stage where we have the brain of a bee, but at the size of a hummingbird. So we can do pollination in the wild, but for a certain specific flowers. But what we want is to do pollination for all the flowers in the world, right? And generally, sunflower is like one of the biggest flowers that we can find. So if you want to pollinate the flowers, which are very small, we have to build something which is as small as a honeybee, which is probably gonna be like 1/100th of the size.
Also taking on this robot bee challenge is Dr. Kevin Chen at MIT.
If I look at the flower, it's just probably about a couple of centimeters. So I have to have very good precision for the robot to approach a flower, gently land on the flower, and with very careful control so that it doesn't fall off. So trying to land on flower, approach a flower is very challenging control problem, but that's something we are actively solving right now.
But the latest robot bees are already capable of some impressive feats. They can fly in all directions, detect and avoid predators, flip 360 degrees, well, sometimes, and they can already identify specific flowers to pollinate.
So we have an AI framework and it goes and searches and detects these flowers. Once you know which flower you want to pollinate, it has a control policy which says that, okay, I want to go down as close as possible. And on the bottom of the robot bee, there's a Velcro which extracts these pollen grains.
The next goal for Chahat and his team is to downsize this robot hummingbird closer to the size of a bee. But that's much easier said than done. Everything is a trade-off between computer power and size. And the major obstacle facing all robot bee pioneers is battery power on something so tiny.
These drones currently have a battery life of about 5 to 7 minutes because of the current state of batteries we have. So one of the things that excites me, how do you come up with this cognitive design, which is very similar to the mind of the bee, to actually get things working on that small of a scale? Because you can't just take an artificial intelligence framework that works on a bigger drone and just downsize it.
Near future, I would say, I would definitely see the bees will be needed to work indoors, in which they will be tethered to a power supply. Thinking about deploying a lot of them in the wild and having them pollinate really requires us to solve the energy or the power challenge first. So if you're really trying to either build more efficient bees, but also waiting for the next breakthrough in battery technology that allows us to have bees, artificial bees that can fly for a much longer time.
But Chahat and his team do have an ingenious solution in the meantime. They're working on an autonomous robo-bee hive, where a massive robot mothership of a drone can fly to a tree, attach, and then deploy its smaller robo-bee babies out to pollinate.
It's easier for the mother bee hive to detect these tree branches because it has the entire depth maps that you see in most of the self-driving cars, right? So it goes and autonomously attaches or latches on, and the mother bee commands these smaller bees. You find, you pollinate, and you come back to the bee. And these entire pipeline is autonomous, right? So if you have a field of about 1,000 flowers, we would need about 8 to 10 small robo bees, which can go around the field and pollinate 1,000 flowers in about 5 to 7 minutes.
But if the goal is essentially robotic pollination, and the intricacies of both flight and power are proving so difficult, do we really need them to fly at all? That's what researcher Yu Gu is looking at with his team at West Virginia University. He's developing a ground-based robot that can pollinate flowers as they go up and down the aisle of an indoor farm.
What we're doing is more like human pollinating, hand pollinating cucumbers in a garden.
So if all goes as planned, with the extra computing power that something like this would bring, there's way more that you might be able to do than just pollinate. Yugu's robots would be able to monitor the plants at the same time and send back reams more data to make farming more efficient and deliver bigger yields.
The ability to pollinate is also the ability to support many other tasks.
So robots in some form are definitely part of the future of farming. But let's go back to the robot bees. Say all goes perfectly well. We resolve the battery power problem. Robot bees are now capable of pollinating fields worth of crops at a time. But swarms of tiny robots that could fly anywhere, record information undetected, and be controlled remotely, what could possibly go wrong with that? Apart from it literally being a Black Mirror episode.
If, say, I'm an evil scientist, I want to do spying on people. From a serious scientist perspective, if I really want to do that evil thing, I probably wouldn't take RoboBee as my first candidate to do those. If I build a rotary vehicle, the aerodynamic efficiency is much higher than flapping wing. Given the current engineering constraint, I probably build a smaller quiet rotor.
So basically, there's better ways to spy on us. Great.
Everything that the bee sees or anything that it sends is computed on the bee itself. And it's not sending these information to any other source and not relying on any other source to do this computation. That stops the risk of the hacking of these tiny drones.
Marginally satisfying, although still relying on a fair bit of trust there. But personal security is not the only concern that people have raised. For a start, ecological waste and damage could be another unintended consequence.
But it seems to me a bit of a flawed solution. They're going to break down, they're going to need maintaining, there's the risk of them being hacked into. Probably a much cheaper solution would be to look after real insects. We are the reason they're declining, and we could use fewer pesticides, leave a little more habitat for them. We often overlook the really obvious simple solution and instead try to invent some really complicated technological fix.
There's certainly no replacement for actual bees. It's estimated that nearly 600 billion worth of global crops depend on pollinators such as bees to grow. They're absolutely essential to global food production, and saving them from collapse has to be a priority. But when it comes to robot bees, it's not exactly an either-or scenario, as the researchers are keen to stress.
We have no intention of replacing bees. We are looking for a solution which could aid or help honeybees.
I think, trying to build robotic prototypes of smaller insects help us to understand insects, and it can be beneficial for the biologists as well.
Evolution has like 3.8 billion years of research and development. We should definitely learn from them.
There are also other pollination scenarios where bees don't even exist in the first place, like here.
We're also thinking about if you want to do assisted agriculture experiment in space. In those cases, of course, now we are using humans, right? The astronaut will be doing the pollination, etc. But hopefully we can automate that process in the longer term.
But it's not only about pollination for these robot bees. The researchers also dream of other exciting real-world applications.
The scenario that I want to give is, for example, there's an earthquake and the building collapsed, and there are people who are trapped inside. With microscale robot can be very useful to search for how many people are trapped and where are those people trapped.
And beyond search and rescue, they can also help us avoid other doomsday scenarios by going where humans struggle to reach, like inspecting weak spots in bridges or helping escape a nuclear meltdown.
These tiny little bee drones, they can go near the surface of these power plants and they can look for the cracks and they can scan the entire thing to understand, okay, is there anything that needs to be repaired before we start this operation?
So while swarms of robot bees might still be decades away, if they happen at all, it's clear that the technology is advancing rapidly. And although it's tempting to pitch bees against robot bees in some Hunger Games style winner takes all, that's not really the case. Actual bees are the real deal and need protecting. But robot bees may well have a part to play.
Okay, here's the question. How are we going to double our electricity usage and make it totally clean?
Net zero. Net zero. Net zero. Net zero.
That's the plan, but what does it really mean? Because here's the thing, our energy is responsible for about 75% of all of our greenhouse gas emissions, but our power consumption is actually expected to double by 2050. So how do we do that without totally destroying the planet?
To find out, I've been talking to lots of scientists and experts,
and there is a lot. Okay, let's start with one of the nicer predictions.
Now, the International Energy Agency say that by 2050, renewables could account for 90% of all of our electricity generation globally.
Okay, that sounds promising.
But to find out what that really means down on the ground, I've come to a UK National Grid site where they're building tunnels to prepare for future energy demand.
Before we go any further, right, what is the grid?
The national grid is really the highway for energy, so we move energy around the country.
And in 2020, renewable energy actually outstripped that from fossil fuels, making up 43% of all the UK's energy.
Here in the UK, as you can see, we have a lot of wind, and that's a really great renewable power source. But in order to get to net zero, we could need 10 times the wattage of what we currently generate with offshore wind. And that could need up to about 7,500 turbines.
Our target is to connect 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, and we need a lot of infrastructure to do that. But we're also looking at what the network needs to be able to do to be more flexible for renewable energy.
Because it's not just wind. All of the UK's renewables will need to increase as well.
When it comes to power, one major thing we need to look at is our reliance on gas.
Gas is still currently in 85% of our homes, and 40% of our electricity is dependent on gas for its production. So gas still plays a huge role in the energy network.
So what will replace natural gas? Well, hydrogen is a bit of a buzzword in net zero.
Because in theory, burning it produces almost entirely water. I mean, it can also produce nitrous oxides, which contribute to acid rain. But it doesn't produce any CO2, so largely it's considered clean energy.
However, it all depends on where you get the hydrogen from.
Hydrogen can be made in a number of different ways, and not all of those ways are clean. So we could make hydrogen from natural gas, turning a fossil fuel into hydrogen. But if we make hydrogen from natural gas and capture the carbon that's emitted during that process, then it can be very much more clean.
Yeah, so what's often left out of the conversations around hydrogen right now is that 96% of it is made from fossil fuels. And even if you capture the carbon that's produced during that process, it's still 20% more carbon emitting than simply burning gas for heat. So it's not solving a problem, is it? But hydrogen can be green if it's made from electricity, and if that electricity comes from renewables. And even though that's only a fraction of how we make hydrogen today, it's not the end of the road for hydrogen, because it could be a game changer for how we store renewable energy.
So with renewables like wind or solar, what do you do when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining? Well, you need to have some energy in the bank.
Batteries have been really successful in terms of storing energy, but the major issue with batteries is that they can't store electricity for long periods of time.
So in addition, we need long duration energy storage, or LDES for short.
There are all sorts of novel ways of storing energy and electricity which are being looked into.
Okay, so there's something called gravity-based energy storage. Literally by lifting and lowering heavy blocks, energy can be stored and then released when needed. Another option is electrothermal storage, where energy is stored, for example, as molten salt, which can be used to power turbines in the same way as gas and coal. You can also convert energy into compressed air and store it underground.
And then there's our old friend hydrogen.
Even though it isn't necessarily efficient or clean to generate hydrogen at the moment, what we're looking at is future technologies whereby we can generate green hydrogen from excess electricity from renewables formed through a process called electrolysis. And that would provide a really nice way of using excess power from renewables and then storing it for when it's needed.
Okay, on to the big question. What's our role in all of this? Because your average individual doesn't own a power station, right? But we are part of the system.
Previously, you would turn your lights on and you wouldn't know where your energy has come from. But if you think now, you have smart meters, apps that can tell you how much it's costing to use certain types of energy. So consumers are playing a bigger role, they're much more invested, and their behaviours are having a bigger influence on the energy network.
So who's responsible for this change?
Achieving net zero is going to have to be a mix of individuals taking responsibility for their own actions, but also recognising that it's not going to happen if we just rely on that. There are going to have to be government policies and quite strong incentives.
So there are some huge changes needed both inside the home and outside to reach net zero. But if everything goes well, we shouldn't feel a difference at home at all. Flick a switch and electricity should just flow. And be green, of course.